back. You know, we talked about chapter 1, just about the labor movement in the United States and about how it's an economic situation. It affects the cost and price. It affects demand and supply of labor, which obviously impacts all of these other aspects. So we've kind of talked about in general, philosophically, this is what industrial relations is. Today we're going to talk about kind of a general history, how it even started. You know, what was the impetus of this? Where did it come from? The one thing we've got to remember is that until the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people say it started around 1880, but the cotton gin was kicking around 1840. So let's don't quibble about that. The point is, for the longest time, really until the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution did not exist in terms of its effect on the United States and that labor way, in terms of employment. Sure, 1880 forward, railroads, steel, the cotton gin, things started just blowing up overnight. Technology was just gone crazy. But up until then, it was just bits and pieces. It was making its inroads, but it wasn't really focused on what was going on in terms of the economic viability of the country. So what we need to talk about is, how did it kind of evolve into what it is? How did that labor movement evolve into what it is? And you got to remember, it really came from, crawling, and then trying to walk, and then trying to run. So let's talk about that, how that came to the United States, because it did come to the United States. The people that came from Europe, that founded this country and started the economic engine that made it work, brought ideas with them from Europe. They brought everything. They brought intelligence, they brought academics, they brought what technology existed in Europe at the time. So now I'm talking 1700, 1720, 1730, those kind of dates. There was business in Europe. Europe had been around for, as we know, a long time, and had actually been involved in commerce for a long time. Shipping was created there. The military institutions were there, making guns, making cannons, building huge cathedrals. Architecture was thriving in Europe. So there were a lot of things going on in Europe. And the people that came from Europe to colonize America brought those things with them. In Europe, they built huge cathedrals. Well, you had to have masons to build masonry, bricklayers to build these cathedrals. You had to have carpenters. In Europe, you had to have people to take care of your horse. You had to have people who were knew about agriculture. You had people that made watches. You had people that made jewelry. So Europe had some actual, what we would call trades. In fact, they used that term. But they didn't call them unions, they called them guilds. G-U-I-L-D-S, trade guilds. Trade guilds were very loose associations, but very powerful. And it was by trade: watchmaker, a brick mason, a carpenter, a blacksmith. So these are the groups that got together to talk about what they did and how they performed their duties and how much they were going to charge for this. However, the trade guilds in Europe were more interested in the union, more interested in the group of workers, more interested in how society worked. The trade guilds would fuss about, we need better roads. The trade guilds would fuss about, we need better layout of towns, we need better plumbing service. So it was very focused on a collective. How can we make this better for everyone? It was also a situation in a trade guild that if a company in the trade guild, an organization in the trade guild, let's say watchmakers, that's a perfect example, came up with a new type of watch, a new technology, that they had to bring it to the guild to say, here is a new technology we have, we would like to start making this. The guild had to allow them, gave them permission, or denied them the opportunity to make that specific product. So it was very collective, and they were doing that to try to protect the guild. We don't want this crazy company over here making this crazy thing that's going to ruin the reputation of watches. So this is the philosophy. You had a union type organization, you had a collective type organization, but it wasn't a union in the type of aspects that we know today. And we're going to talk about that evolution, but that's the philosophy that came from Europe to the United States. So you had people that had trades that came from Europe to the United States. You had people that now learn trades once they were born in the United States, but the whole philosophy of trades came from that European mentality. However, as 1700s moved on and as the revolution kind of, they started fussing and fighting about 1740, they didn't wake up in 1776 and go, oh, by the way, we want independence. That transpired decades. That thought was ongoing. So you had these trade guilds working in this very volatile political situation of the late 1700s. In fact, one of the first instances we have of trade guilds making an impact, or at least being noticed in terms of economic pressure, was in 1778. The New York journeyman printers were a trade guild. And they came over, and these are the guys that printed the books, printed the newspapers, did the printing work, which was very, very significant industry. They decided they were not making enough money by the people who hired them to print these facilities, these books, these newspapers. And they didn't strike, but they went and they had discussions, and they threatened to withhold their labor, et cetera, and actually got concessions on wages. So early on, 1778, you've got, that's right after, that's during the Revolutionary War, by the way. So you had these concessions of these owners that owned these publications that said, yeah, maybe you printers deserve a little bit more money, and they actually acquiesced to that. But in 1794, we had the Philadelphia cordwainers, shoemakers, who decided that they wanted more wage. It was a deal where price per shoe, depending on who wanted the shoe, the quality of the shoe, and the owners of the shoe companies were literally, if I'm paying a lower price, if I'm charging a lower price for this shoe, I'm going to pay you a lower wage to make the shoe. They decided that they were going to try to withhold their labor. They were going to try to put some kind of pressure on the company to meet their demands. Here's about the first time the government got involved on the side of the organizations, the companies, the capitalists, and said, maybe we need to keep this company rolling. That's better for the company. Taxes will roll in if the company stays open. These people that own the company are part of the society that kind of keeps that engine rolling. So maybe we ought to side with them, and that's kind of what they did. In fact, they came up with something in this era called the conspiracy doctrine that says you cannot conspire. Well, if a union gets together and talks about what we're going to do, that in itself is a conspiracy. You cannot conspire to shut down commerce. Commerce is good. Commerce helps everybody. So you can't do anything that's going to interfere with commerce. So 1778, off the top of the, right out the chute, unions kind of have a little bit of power. But they're still called trade guilds. They're not called unions now. So these guilds kind of had a little bit of power, won that situation. 1794, the government stepped in and said, wait a minute. We need to protect these owners. We need to protect the economy to keep this thing rolling. So we're going to put roadblocks in your way, Mr. Worker, that's going to say, absolutely not. You just got to back off a little bit. You're being selfish. It's for the good of the people. So it was kind of mixed reviews. So then we get out of the Revolutionary War, and our government's still in its fledging kind of situation. You need to go read history. You really do. And I'm not trying to sound like your granddaddy or go, you need to read, but you really need to read. George Washington kind of believed that we should have a king. Not the one in England, because we didn't like that one, but a monarchy, people having office for life, that's not such a bad idea. John Adams, the second president of the United States, said, I agree with George Washington. Maybe we need to have more of that. It wasn't until Thomas Jefferson came along, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, by the way, and said, absolutely not. We do not want hereditary government here. We don't want people here elected for life. We don't want people here to have a position because of who their father was. Thomas Jefferson had a huge fight with George Washington, with John Adams. Read the history. It's fascinating. We talk about the founding fathers like they all sat around and smoked cigars and loved each other. They did not. It was a very volatile period. So you've got that going on. You've got that political period going on where it is not all happy. You had the Federalists and you had the Republicans, and they were at each other's throats. Federalists wanted monarchy almost. The Republicans said absolutely not. The common man needs to vote. The common man needs to rule this country. So in this political turmoil, you've got this labor movement that's saying, we need a little more too. We need a little protection too. So I can't imagine the volatility of that era. But now we're in the early 1800s. And commerce is rocking along, just like it was, but technology is starting to boom. Railroads. You cannot believe the impact of the railroads. Thomas Jefferson wrote that it was amazing what you could do and how fast you could go. Talking fast, they thought 20 miles an hour was the speed of light. That was amazing. But this is it. Compare 20 miles an hour to a horse going 3 miles an hour, or a human being walking 2 miles an hour. So, goodness, by a factor of 10, I've increased speed. It's almost like a time machine. So technology was just blowing up. And because it was blowing up, there were now new opportunities for industry, new things to be made. Again, the cotton gin. There's a dispute over when it was invented and who invented it. We give credit to Eli Whitney. But the 1840s, up until then, to make a shirt, it took forever just to make the cloth. Sewing a shirt together is a piece of cake. I can do that in a couple hours. Back in the day, to make the cloth, I had to sit at a loom. But before it went to the loom, I literally had to create the thread from the cotton fabric. Imagine doing that. Just think of how you would do that. It was unbelievable. Long, horrible, took forever. That's why if you got a shirt in 1800, you had it for life. You took care of it. That's why it had patches all over it. It was so hard to make another shirt. All of a sudden, Eli Whitney invents this thing called a cotton gin, which is very simple if you think about what it actually does. But it was a machine where you would dump all this cotton with all the seeds, nasty, and you would run it and run it and run it. And believe it or not, thread would come out kind of the other end. Unbelievable. Or at least a product that you could turn into thread, just like that, came out the other end. So industry is starting to really pick up because technology is allowing people to now say, or capitalists to now say, I need 100 people. I need 100 people every day to come into this building, use this technology, and it's going to really move us forward. Every man can have a shirt once a year now. So that was the thought. It was like, this is just the new world, the new horizon. So what you see is, from like 1800 basically to the Civil War, you've got this increase in technology. But you've also got the situation where you have the people that own the companies are hiring people off the land, which was always basically a starvation kind of existence. So people would say it's better to go work for a guy for $1 an hour, $1 a day, excuse me, $1 a day, than it is to worry about the rain or the heat and the fact that I work all day and I work all months and I didn't get a piece of food from that, and it just went to nothing. So the opportunities to go work in industry were compelling, even though they were not real pleasing. They were compelling because it was that versus starvation. So you have this buildup of industry from 1800s to 1860 to the start of the Civil War. People really don't like it. People have been used to living on the farm. People have been used to, if I'm on the farm and I need to go take a glass of water, a drink of water, I just put my hoe down, I go get a drink of water. People working on the farm said, if I need to go to the bathroom, I just go over to the woods and go to the bathroom. I don't have to worry about it. All of a sudden, we took those people, and I'm out in the fresh air, and yeah, it was hot or it was cold, but the point is I'm outside. I take those people who literally have spent their whole life doing that, and I put them in this four-walled building. Most of them didn't have windows. If they had windows, it was not to help you look out. It was to bring light in. The facilities were terrible. There was no occupation health and safety situation back then. They didn't care if you cut your leg off or not. So you go from this, I'm outside, at least it's fresh air, to you put me in this box, hot or cold, dangerous, smelly, no light, and you making me work 10 hours a day, or as long as you can keep me there before I pass out. In fact, the plan back then was you would bring an employee in the morning and you would work him as hard as you could so that you could let him go home and go to bed at night and be able to get up in the next morning recovered so that he could work for you again. The only reason I didn't kill you today, the only reason I didn't work you so hard today that you couldn't recover was that you wouldn't come back tomorrow. So they did experiments. Well, they really weren't experiments, but they basically would take you to 8 hours sleep and bring you back here tomorrow, and that's all. And that's what they would do. It was not a fun time. So all the rights were to the owner of the company from the 1800s to 1860. All of the government was behind that. They had laws like conspiracy theory, which said you can't even get together and talk about it. So all of a sudden, the Industrial Revolution is kicking. Employment, as we know it today, industrial employment is growing, and there is a lot of discourse. The people that came into that did it basically to avoid starvation, but after they finally got a little bit of food, then they said, this is still terrible. So then we run into 1860s, we run into another political turmoil, Civil War. And we're not going to talk about the Civil War. Just a very, very difficult time in the history of the United States. But it changed people's minds. You know, maybe I don't have to work like this. Maybe I do have some rights. So in 1866, the first real, what we would call a union, not a trade guild, a union, 1866 started, and it was called the National Labor Union. An original name, the National Labor Union. Their focus was on politics. It mirrored the trade guilds in that sense. Collective, politics. What we want to do is we want to appeal to the owner of the company. We want to appeal to our representatives at the state level or at the federal level to pass laws that would make it better for us. Pass laws that would say, give them a little more money. Pass laws that would say, we really need to treat these people better. We need to look out for their welfare. And that was their focus. Writing letters, talking to people. They talked about things, this is 1866. Think about this. They talked about things like an 8-hour workday. They talked about things like that employment should be open to everyone, men, women, and African Americans. 1866, this is unbelievable. This is radical thinking. But their focus was, we're going to write you a letter, we're going to plead with you, beg you to change your mind, Mr. Congressman, so you'll pass this law. You got to give them hats off. They started it out of nothing. It's the first national union. In fact, that's what it was called, the National Labor Union. It was very ineffective, except that it did start changing some minds, but in terms of the things they really wanted to happen, very ineffective. 3 years later, there was a group in that organization that became dissatisfied. It's just not working, and they created something called the Knights of Labor. 1869, the Knights of Labor. Think about this. How close can you be to Europe? You're calling yourself the Knights. We don't have Knights over here. They had Knights over in Europe. The Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor started in Philadelphia. It did not believe in withholding your labor as a tactic. It was very similar to the National Labor Union by saying that we're going to take political focus. We're going to try to change the minds of our politicians. Surely they see that this is not good. Surely they see that these people are not being treated well, and they will step up and ask these companies, please do it voluntarily, and if not, we'll pass laws that say you have to treat better. It just really was very philosophical, very ideology driven. However, it was very, very unsuccessful. It did not work. However, by 1886, there were almost 1 million members. So it was effective in that way. However, by 1893, there were less than 100,000 members, simply because it wasn't effective and it did not work. So the point of 1866 National Labor Union and 1869 the Knights of Labor was that it was the beginning, it was the impetus. Finally, people said, we really need some change here. They didn't know how to go about it. They thought this was going to be effective. It turned out not to be effective at all. But the point was, things had started to move philosophically. So now we get to the mid-1800s, 1886 to be exact, and we start what's known as the American Federation of Labor. AFL, we know it today, it's still around. Not only is it still around, it has been one of the moving factors in the labor movement in the United States since 1886. 1886, the American Federation of Labor was started by a guy named Sam Gompers. He was a big old crusty cigar maker from New York City. And Sam Gompers said this, give me the money. I really don't care about the roads, and I don't care about the school children really, and I'm not caring. Tell you what, give me the money. If I want to give it to the school district or the politicians to build better roads, that's fine. But let me make that decision. Give me the money. Okay, everybody understand that? And if you don't give me the money, if you do not pay me an honest wage for what I'm doing, I will withhold my labor. I will strike you. I will leave you and your factory empty all day, and you won't make a dime. Now, we know the converse of that argument is neither will I. I won't get a wage. But that wasn't Sam Gompers. He was trying to scare people. He said, we're going to strike you. We want money. Forget about all this other stuff. We absolutely want some money. So 1886, American Federation of Labor. This is the birth of unionism in the United States as we know it. And not a whole lot has changed in philosophy since 1886. You know, Gompers said, I want the money. I'll make the decision. Give me the money, and then I'll take it and do with it what I want. If I'm going to spend it on myself, I will. If I'm going to spend it on the school systems, I will. But that's my decision. Let me make it. As you can imagine, this was not met very well. Companies said, we don't like this at all. You bunch of, you just a bunch of workers. What do y'all know? If it wasn't for us, you'd be starving to death anyway. So this wasn't like, oh, thank you, Sam, you brought us this wonderful philosophy and we're just going to use it. It was not met well at all. In fact, the period from 1886 to about 1920 was absolutely the most violent period in our labor. There's situations where companies would go in and literally shoot union workers that were on strike. Just shoot them, kill them. There are very famous cases about this. We're going to talk about two, but there are very famous cases where there was just abject, just the most unbelievable violence you can imagine. It was almost army versus army. People died, and no one was ever convicted, except if you were a union member. If you were a union member and one of the people that got shot that was trying to get you to go back where got killed, you were in trouble. But if you got shot as a union member, we don't know where that bullet came from. So everybody was on the side of the company. The law, the police, the courts, everybody, the politicians. In 1892, there's a very famous case, the Homestead Carnegie Steel Plant went on strike. Absolutely went on strike. And not only did they go on strike, they took over the building. They occupied the building. Now, come on, that's illegal. That's private property, but they did that. They occupied the building, and they occupied their building with weapons. They had guns. A little known fact, there's a group nowadays called the Pinkertons. We all know the Pinkertons. They work at ball games and they work at rock concerts, and they provide security, and Pinkertons are great. The Pinkertons were established to fight the unions. The Pinkertons are not policemen. They're a private security force that was established basically to go in and make union workers do what the companies wanted them to do. That's the history of the Pinkertons. The Homestead plant was right on a river, which allowed for power and allowed for transportation up and down the river to bring in products and to take away products. The Pinkertons got a boat. They tried to assault from the front. They could not get in that way. They decided they would do a maritime approach, come in from the river. So they had a barge that was bringing the Pinkertons in to land and make this assault on the back of the plant. The union members had somehow acquired a cannon, and they're shooting cannons at this boat that's coming up the river. That's unimaginable today. That's the kind of stuff that was going on. Absolute violence. There was a case in North Carolina where a textile plant went on strike, and the workers again occupied the textile plant, and they brought in, not only they didn't bring in the Pinkerton, they brought in the state militia, people that worked for the state, and said, go get those guys. Well, they came in the front, or they came into the plant one way, and they were shooting, and the state militia was winning, so the union members, the textile workers, ran out the back door into the woods. For 3 days, the state militia hunted those guys down and shot them when they found them. Nobody ever went to jail for that. So this is the kind of violence that we saw. And the violence is, here are the union members, they don't want to work, they want more whatever, wage or benefits. The company owners and the powers that be, the state, the federal, the local, the governments, the militias, the police force, they were all against the unions. They did exactly what they were told to do, and if you said go get those guys out of there, they did that with extreme prejudice. That brings us to 1894, the Pullman strike. The Pullman Company makes railroad cars. They still do to this day. They made back then the very luxury car, the first class car. So it was a huge industry. The railroad industry in the 1890s was the largest employer, single employer of people in the United States. Think about it. This technology was booming. Everything moved by rail. So not only did you build railroad cars, you hooked them all together, you drove them, you worked for the railroad fixing the tracks. It was just a huge, huge industry. So the Pullman workers decided, and they had a union, they decided they weren't making enough money. And in addition to that, the Pullman company had been laying people off. I mean, just incredible layoffs. Back in those days, had what they called factory towns, where the company you worked for would own a house, you'd stay there. Oh, they'd charge you for it, but that's where you lived. There really wasn't any other place you could live. They started kicking people out of their houses, laying off about 30–40% of the workforce, lowering wage for those that still employed, and so they had this union, so they decided they would start striking. And so they started striking. And the company used everything they could, the conspiracy doctrine. They used a couple of things we're going to talk about in a minute to try to get these people back to work. But there were so many of them. It was huge. It wasn't like 100 guys over here. It was thousands of people all across the nation. And it was real hard for the government or the police force to go and arrest everybody. So it was very ineffective for the police to try to make these workers go back to work. In addition, not only were these people making Pullman cars, there were thousands of Pullman cars in existence already being driven around by railroads. So the union came up with a great idea. We will talk to our other union buddies that maybe don't work at Pullman, but they work in the railroad industry, and they'll say, look, don't hook up a Pullman car. Now what that means is that you've got the engine here, and then you got the next car, and then the next car, and the next car, and you got to hook them all together. Well, they said, they went out and they said, if there's a Pullman car in the line, don't hook it up. And these were the only people that could hook it up. They were the only ones that had the training. Don't hook it up. So they were literally keeping these railroads, keeping these trains from moving because they refused to hook up a Pullman car. And it was very effective. And so all these other people are calling Pullman going, you need to fix that. What, these guys are crazy, you know. The federal government came to Pullman's aid. Every train that moved in the United States, probably today, but I'm surely back then, had what was called a mail car on it. That's the way mail moved all around the country. It was the only way you could move effectively around the country. And you can't mess with the U.S. mail. That is a federal offense. So these companies would hook a mail car behind the Pullman car, and if you did not hook up the Pullman car, or if you unhooked it, you were basically messing with the U.S. mail. And that's how they stopped that strike, because now it's a federal offense. You can go to prison. And they started sending people to prison. And these workers went, man, we can't win here. The federal government is using federal law. They're stretching, but they're using federal law to prevent us from withholding our labor or prevent us from striking like we should be able to. So that just shows the depth that the government, that the people that own the companies would go to fight the worker back in the day. There were two basic other things that companies used to put down strikes, keep people from striking, et cetera, et cetera. The first one was called the injunction. We still have injunctions today. Here's why we use injunctions. I've got a house, and my neighbor is next door, and we don't have a fence between our yards. It's just green out there and trees, and it's pretty, and so there's never been a fence, and we've kind of decided that'd make it ugly, so we just neither one, and there's no reason to put a fence up. We don't need a fence. And you've got this beautiful oak tree that's right there on what you think is your property line. And you come home one afternoon and there's a guy out there putting a big red X on your oak tree, and you walk up and you say, "Buddy, what are you doing? That's my tree." He goes, "No, that's your neighbor's tree, and he wants me to cut it down." You can get an injunction. You can quickly get an injunction from the courts, usually has to come from a judge, that says basically, stop what you're doing right now. Just stop. There's confusion here that the legal system needs to determine what's the right course of action. But until we can decide what to do, just stop. So Mr. Tree Cutter, you can't do that yet. There's an injunction that says do not cut that tree down. Not forever. Do not cut that tree down till we decide whether you can or cannot cut the tree down. That's a great thing. We still have the injunction today. They use the injunction. Company owners use the injunction all from basically the Civil War up until 1932, and we'll talk about that later. They use the injunction. A company would go on, a union would go on strike. They would leave the company, withhold their labor. The guy at the company who knows, friends with the judges, friends with the police force, part of that big society, would call a judge and say, "I need an injunction." They have withheld their labor, and so the judge would fill out an injunction. He would say, "Stop what you're doing. You might be right. This company might be treating you so bad that you have every right not to go to work, but we don't know that yet. We'll look into it and we'll decide. But you go back to work right now, and we'll let you know what we decide. Who's right here?" Well, bottom line is they never did that. But they would go with the injunction and say, "Here it is, go back to work, or you are now in contempt of court." So companies use the injunction all day long. The federal government, the state government, actually had the power to look at you and go, "You cannot lay off of work today. You have to go to work." Think about that. The second thing that companies used besides the injunction was called the yellow dog contract. When you went to work for a company, a lot of them would just give you one little tiny sheet of paper, a contract that said, "I promise I will never join a union. I will not encourage union. I won't do anything that deals with a union, including speaking about it. And if I do, you can fire me," and they would sign their name. And now it's a contract. So if you ever said, "Hey, they fired me and it wasn't fair," they'd hold up the contract and say, "Oh, there it is. You broke the contract. You're fired." And the courts went, "Absolutely, you're fired. Nothing you can do." So companies use two main things. They use the injunction and they use the yellow dog contract to keep people in line, to keep them from withholding their labor. So then we've got a lot of things to talk about, and we're going to talk about them later on, about historical situations that happened. We're going to talk a lot about laws, these different laws that came about that turned this tide. But this process that we just talked about basically takes us up into that period. So we're in the early 1900s. We've got injunctions. We've got yellow dog contracts. We've got violence perpetrated basically against the union. So what we see now is, as we move into the 1900s, you've got companies using the injunction. You've got companies using the yellow dog contract. You've got just extreme violence against anybody that withholds their labor. All of the political power is on the side of the companies. Then around 1915, we go into World War I. So all of a sudden the attention in the United States is somewhere else besides, labor situations and labor bargaining. Then we come out of that, we get to the Roaring '20s. All of a sudden we have just crime, organized crime. We have issues with alcohol. We have prohibition. So it's a tumultuous time in the United States. And then in 1926, we finally come to a situation where the federal government says maybe we need to listen to these unions and maybe at least throw them a bone. Give them something that will maybe appease them. And what happened in 1926, and we're going to talk about that ad nauseum later on, but just a precursor in 1926. You remember we talked about in 1994 the Pullman Act, excuse me, yeah, 1894, Pullman Act, or the Pullman situation. That railroads were just such a dominant industry. Well, it was even more dominant in early 1920s. You know, the automobile industry was fledgling, so it was in existence. But good gracious, everything moved by freight. By the way, everything moves by freight today too, or boat. So everything's moving by freight. It's huge. It's a vital component of our economic engine. Tons of people work for the railroad industry. Just a lot of people. So the union isn't worried about, well, I'm a bricklayer, will you work with me? I'm a pipe fitter over here. You didn't have to get those groups together. Here was the railroad workers. They were just huge, tons of workers. They literally, even though Pullman Act was squashed, I mean the Pullman situation was squashed because of the federal government and because of mail trains. You know, now we're 20 years later, and it's even bigger than it was, and we have even more power than we had because we're so dependent. The country was so dependent on the railroads that the workers in the railroad industry said, we can fight this. We can shut down the railroads. People started shutting the railroads down. Union workers stopped withholding their labor, and all of a sudden, America was mad. We had become used to the convenience of a product being on the shelf every time I went to the store because this railroad was bringing it in every time. Well, all of a sudden, my washing powder wasn't there. Or all of a sudden, that food that I was going to feed my family wasn't there because the unions were stopping these railroads. All of a sudden, you had the population fussing at these congressmen, not just the unions, but you had people from all walks of life calling up their congressman going, how dare you, you need to fix this, my child doesn't have food, I don't have the necessities I need, they should be there, the only reason they're not there is because you won't talk to the guy who owns this railroad and have him settle this thing. So because there was so much pressure, and obviously that pressure started in the 20s, you know, anytime there's a piece of legislation, back up 5 or 10 years, that's when the fussing started. So in 1926, we had something called the Railroad Labor Act, and we'll talk about that at a later date. But the point is, in 1926, the tide changes. The tide changes. We talked about 1866 was the first shot across modern day, the American labor movement. 1926, Railroad Labor Act, is absolutely the time when it turned into the modern labor movement that we know today. All right, we're going to start with that in another segment. We're going to get deep into legislation, federal legislation, which dictated to both sides, the companies and the labor unions, all right, we're in this together. There needs to be some rules as to how we can affect the relationship, because your relationship is affecting the entire nation. Your relationship is affecting the economic engine that's driving this country. And we've kind of given it to you to be on your own and figure out what you want to do, and y'all have not done a good job at all. So, starting with 1926, the Railroad Labor Act, boom, federal government is now going to get involved and start helping you guys do what you should have done on your own. And we're going to start there. So hopefully this gives you just a little history, you know, from pre-revolutionary times up until 1926 as to how the labor movement in the United States progressed and why it progressed. What were the pressures that made it happen? So I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you next time. Peace.